I accidentally insulted my boss in a meeting last week, and it made him trust me more. Here's the psychological trick that turned my mistake into the strongest professional relationship I've ever had, and why hiding your flaws is actually destroying your credibility. When you meet someone new, your brain has approximately 3 seconds to make a critical decision about whether this person is friend or foe, trustworthy or suspicious, someone to engage with or someone to guard against. This ancient survival mechanism, rooted deep in our limbic system, operates far faster than our conscious thought processes. What most people don't realize is that you can hijack this automatic trust assessment by doing something counterintuitive, revealing a small personal struggle or admitting a minor mistake within those crucial first 3 seconds. This isn't manipulation, it's understanding how human psychology actually works, and using that knowledge to build authentic connections. The mechanism behind this phenomenon is what psychologists call reciprocal vulnerability, and it triggers one of the most powerful social instincts hardwired into the human brain, the reciprocity principle. When you share something slightly vulnerable about yourself immediately upon meeting someone, you're essentially making the first move in a delicate social dance. Your brain is signaling to their brain that you don't perceive them as a threat, that you're willing to lower your defenses, and most importantly, that you trust them enough to see a small imperfection in your armor. This creates an instant psychological debt in the other person's mind. Not a conscious debt, but a subconscious compulsion to match your level of openness. Research in social psychology has repeatedly demonstrated that people who share vulnerabilities early in interactions are perceived as more trustworthy, more likable, and paradoxically, more competent than those who present a flawless facade. This seems to contradict everything we've been taught about first impressions, but the data is clear. When you admit you got lost on the way to the meeting, or that you're terrible with names and might need a reminder, or that you're slightly nervous about a presentation, you're activating what neuroscientists call the mirror neuron system in the other person's brain. They literally begin to feel what you're feeling, and that shared emotional experience creates the foundation for trust. The timing is critical because our brains are most receptive to social bonding cues in those initial moments of contact. After the 3-second window closes, people begin constructing narratives about who you are based on the limited data they've collected. If that data shows only perfection, competence, and carefully curated professionalism, their brain categorizes you as potentially competitive, possibly deceptive, and emotionally distant. But if your opening includes a small human moment, a minor admission of imperfection, their brain takes a completely different path. You become categorized as authentic, approachable, and psychologically safe to engage with. This triggers the reciprocity instinct at a deep neurological level. Studies using functional MRI scans have shown that when someone shares personal information with us, even minor details, the reward centers in our brain light up. We experience a small dopamine hit, and our brain immediately begins searching for something equivalent to share in return. This isn't conscious deliberation. It happens automatically, beneath the threshold of awareness. The other person suddenly finds themselves wanting to reveal something about themselves, to match your vulnerability with their own, to maintain the social equilibrium you've created. The beauty of this mechanism is that it creates a self-reinforcing loop. Your initial 3-second vulnerability prompts their reciprocal sharing, which makes you feel more comfortable sharing something slightly deeper, which encourages them to do the same. Within minutes, you've established a level of trust and rapport that might otherwise take weeks or months to develop through conventional professional interactions. You've essentially accelerated the entire trust-building process by understanding and leveraging the psychological architecture that governs human connection. The difference between vulnerability that builds bridges and vulnerability that burns them down comes down to a psychological concept called appropriate disclosure, and understanding this distinction is absolutely critical if you want to harness the power of the vulnerability loop without sabotaging yourself. Your brain is constantly calibrating social risk, running rapid calculations about how much information is safe to reveal in any given context, and when you miscalculate this equation, the consequences can be devastating. The key is understanding that not all vulnerabilities are created equal in the eyes of the human psyche, and what creates connection in one context can create profound discomfort in another. Low-stakes vulnerability operates within what psychologists call the comfort zone of disclosure. This is the sweet spot where your admission is personal enough to feel genuine but not so heavy that it burdens the other person or triggers their threat response. When you share that you're directionally challenged and got turned around finding the office, or that you always forget people's names at networking events, or that public speaking makes your palms sweat, you're revealing something authentic about yourself without creating what's known as emotional labor for the listener. Their brain can process this information quickly, relate to it easily, and respond without feeling overwhelmed or responsible for managing your emotional state. The neuroscience behind this is fascinating. When someone shares appropriate vulnerability, it activates the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain associated with social bonding and empathy. But when someone overshares or reveals trauma too quickly, it triggers the amygdala, the brain's alarm system, and suddenly the other person's nervous system shifts into a stress response. They're no longer connecting with you. They're trying to escape from you, or at minimum, trying to figure out how to manage the uncomfortable situation you've created. This is the fundamental difference between vulnerability that attracts and vulnerability that repels. High-stakes vulnerability, particularly trauma disclosure or deeply personal struggles, violates what social psychologists call the norm of graduated exchange. Human relationships are designed to deepen gradually, with each person revealing progressively more intimate information as trust is established over time. When you skip steps in this process by leading with your divorce, your mental health diagnosis, your childhood trauma, or your financial crisis, you're essentially asking a stranger to hold emotional weight they haven't agreed to carry. Their brain interprets this as a boundary violation, even if consciously they feel sympathy for your situation. Research in interpersonal psychology has identified a phenomenon called compassion fatigue, where exposure to others' trauma, especially unexpectedly or without consent, actually reduces empathy rather than increasing I. When you overshare in those first few seconds, you're not creating the vulnerability loop. You're creating what's known as an empathy deficit, where the other person's emotional resources become depleted before any genuine connection is formed. They may respond with polite concern, but internally their brain is categorizing you as someone who lacks social calibration, someone who might be emotionally exhausting, someone to maintain careful distance from. The art of appropriate vulnerability lies in selecting admissions that humanize you without traumatizing the other person. Think of it as the difference between saying you're nervous about a presentation versus revealing you have crippling anxiety that's destroyed your career. Both are vulnerable, but only one invites connection while respecting boundaries. Your vulnerability should create a doorway, not dump a burden. It should signal authenticity without demanding emotional caretaking. When you master this calibration, you unlock the true power of strategic vulnerability, building trust rapidly while maintaining the psychological safety that allows genuine relationships to flourish. The goal is always to create comfort, never to create the obligation to comfort you. The moment you share an appropriate vulnerability with someone, something extraordinary happens in their psychological landscape that most people completely miss. You're not just revealing information about yourself, you're fundamentally altering the perceived safety level of the entire interaction, and this shift in perceived safety is what psychologists call creating a secure base for authentic communication. When the other person witnesses your willingness to be imperfect, to show a crack in your professional armor, their brain makes an instantaneous recalibration about what's permissible in this relationship. The invisible walls that normally govern polite but surface-level interaction suddenly become more porous, more flexible, and the other person finds themselves in a psychological space where authenticity feels not just possible, but almost mandatory. This phenomenon operates through what researchers call social modeling. Human beings are fundamentally imitative creatures. Our mirror neuron systems are constantly scanning our environment for cues about appropriate behavior, and when we observe someone taking a social risk, our brain automatically begins calculating whether we should match that risk level. It's not a conscious decision. It's an automatic neural process that happens in milliseconds. When you admit you're terrible with technology and fumbled setting up the video call, you're essentially giving the other person permission to admit their own technological incompetence. When you confess you're nervous about the presentation, you're signaling that nervousness is acceptable in this space, and suddenly they feel safe admitting their own anxieties. The loop mechanism works because of a principle in social psychology known as disclosure reciprocity, which states that self-disclosure from one person typically prompts self-disclosure from another person at approximately the same level of intimacy. But here's where it gets fascinating. The reciprocity isn't just about matching content, it's about matching depth. Your brain is constantly monitoring the vulnerability level of social exchanges, and when someone reveals something at a certain depth, your brain experiences what's called equilibrium disruption. The social balance has shifted, and your nervous system feels a compulsion to restore balance by offering something of equivalent weight. This isn't politeness. This is neurological architecture in action. What makes this a loop rather than a simple exchange is that each cycle of vulnerability breeds slightly deeper vulnerability. Research in relational psychology has shown that trust doesn't build linearly, it builds in spirals. Your initial small disclosure prompts their small disclosure, which makes you feel safer making a slightly bigger disclosure, which prompts them to go slightly deeper, and before either person consciously realizes it, you've descended together into a level of authenticity that would normally take months to achieve. The psychological safety you created in those first 3 seconds becomes a self-reinforcing system, where each revelation makes the next revelation easier, more natural, more inevitable. The neuroscience underlying this process involves oxytocin, often called the bonding hormone. When we engage in mutual vulnerability, our brains release oxytocin, which simultaneously reduces fear and increases feelings of trust and connection. But here's the critical insight. Oxytocin release in social bonding isn't a one-time event. It's cyclical. Each exchange of authentic information triggers another oxytocin release, which reduces barriers to further sharing, which triggers more oxytocin release. You're not just building trust, you're creating a biochemical feedback loop that makes both parties increasingly comfortable with progressively deeper levels of authenticity. This is why the vulnerability loop is so powerful and why it fundamentally differs from traditional relationship building approaches. You're not slowly earning trust over time through demonstrated competence and reliability, though those certainly matter. You're catalyzing trust immediately by creating the neurological and psychological conditions where authenticity feels safe, natural, and reciprocal. You're transforming a potential adversarial or neutral interaction into a cooperative, vulnerable space where both people can lower their defensive shields simultaneously. That mutual disarmament is the foundation upon which all genuine human connection is built. For decades, conventional wisdom in psychology and professional development insisted that competence was the primary driver of trust. Display your credentials, showcase your achievements, demonstrate your expertise, and trust would naturally follow. But groundbreaking research over the past 15 years has completely upended this model, revealing something that seems almost paradoxical on its surface. Controlled vulnerability activates trust mechanisms in the human brain far more rapidly and reliably than demonstrations of pure competence ever could. This isn't just interesting theory. This is empirical data from neuroscience labs, functional brain imaging studies, and large-scale social psychology experiments that have fundamentally rewritten our understanding of how trust actually forms in the human mind. The research centers on what neuroscientists call the trust network in the brain, a constellation of structures including the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the anterior cingulate cortex, and the temporoparietal junction. When these regions activate simultaneously, we experience the subjective feeling of trust, and studies using real-time brain imaging have shown something remarkable. These trust centers light up significantly more intensely when someone displays controlled vulnerability than when they display competence alone. The data is unequivocal. A person admitting a small mistake while demonstrating basic competence triggers more trust-related neural activity than a person displaying flawless expertise without any vulnerable moments. The explanation lies in how our brains evolved to assess trustworthiness in social environments. For hundreds of thousands of years, the most dangerous threats to human survival weren't predators or natural disasters. They were humans who might deceive, manipulate, or exploit us. Our ancestors developed sophisticated neural mechanisms for detecting deception, and one of the most reliable signals our brain uses to assess honesty is the willingness to reveal information that doesn't serve immediate self-interest. When someone shows you only their strengths, only their successes, only their polished professional facade, an ancient part of your brain registers this as potentially strategic information management. You might be impressed by their competence, but your trust circuits remain partially suppressed because your threat detection system is asking, what are they hiding? Controlled vulnerability short-circuits this defensive screening process. When someone voluntarily reveals a flaw, admits an error, or acknowledges an imperfection, your brain's deception detection algorithms essentially stand down. The logic is evolutionarily sound. If this person is willing to show me something that makes them look less impressive, they're probably not trying to manipulate me. This assessment happens beneath conscious awareness, in the same rapid, automatic way your brain processes facial expressions or tone of voice. Research by psychologist Brené Brown and neuroscientist Paul Zak has demonstrated that vulnerability triggers oxytocin release in observers, the same neurochemical that facilitates mother-infant bonding, and this oxytocin cascade directly inhibits the amygdala's threat response, while activating trust-related brain regions. What makes this particularly powerful is that the competence you display after the vulnerable moment gets amplified in the other person's perception. Social psychology research calls this the pratfall effect, named after classic studies showing that highly competent people who make small mistakes are actually rated as more likable and trustworthy than equally competent people who make no mistakes at all. The vulnerability doesn't diminish your competence in their eyes. It humanizes it. It makes your capabilities feel more accessible, more genuine, more real. Your brain evolved to be suspicious of perfection because perfection in nature is usually an illusion, a carefully constructed facade designed to deceive. The implications are profound for anyone seeking to build trust rapidly in professional or personal contexts. You're not choosing between appearing competent or appearing vulnerable. You're strategically sequencing them to activate different neural pathways in a specific order that maximizes trust formation. The vulnerability opens the door by deactivating threat responses. The competence walks through that door and registers with full impact because it's now being processed by a brain in a receptive, trusting state rather than a defensive, evaluative state. This is why the 3-second vulnerability rule works. You're not sacrificing credibility. You're creating the neurological conditions where your credibility can actually be perceived and trusted rather than scrutinized and doubted. So here's what I want you to understand. Every single day, you're walking into rooms full of people whose brains are unconsciously deciding whether you're trustworthy or not, and most of you are losing that battle before you even open your mouth. You're so busy trying to look perfect, so focused on hiding your flaws, so terrified of appearing weak that you're actually activating the exact neural mechanisms that make people distrust you. Your polished facade isn't protecting you, it's isolating you. It's keeping you locked outside the circle of genuine connection while you wonder why relationships feel so hard, why networking feels so exhausting, why people seem guarded around you. But now you know the truth. You know that your brain and their brain are running ancient software designed for a different world. And you can either keep fighting against that software, or you can learn to work with it. You know that 3 seconds of strategic vulnerability can accomplish what 3 months of perfect professionalism never will. You know that the very thing you've been hiding, those small human imperfections, are actually your most powerful tool for building the trust, the influence, and the connections that will transform every area of your life. The question isn't whether this works. The neuroscience is settled, the data is clear. The question is whether you have the courage to use it. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Knowing this information changes nothing. Applying it changes everything. Tomorrow, you'll meet someone new. You'll have 3 seconds. What are you going to do with them?